Connor, happy Earthling Day.
Hey, Andrew. Happy Earthling Day to you too.
How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing pretty good. We are almost through getting everything ready to post. So, that's a good feeling, getting ready for closing everything up.
Yeah, and this was a less hectic and stressful Earthling, I would say, than the typical Friday. We got everything wrapped up pretty early. I guess I'll go ahead and introduce us. I'm Andrew Day, staff writer at Robert Wright's Nonzero Newsletter on Substack. You are Connor Echols, the managing editor at Robert Wright's Nonzero Newsletter. And this is a very special edition of Earthling Unplugged, where we talk about the latest issue of the Earthling, the Friday edition of the newsletter. And we also share hot takes and stray thoughts on current events. And the reason this episode of Earthling Unplugged is so special is that, as viewers and listeners may already have noticed, the head honcho, Robert Wright, is not here. He was in a tragic baking accident, just burned his eyebrows clean off, so he doesn't want to appear on video. But we're told he'll survive. No, he's traveling, and it sounds like he's quite busy. So really, we could gossip and gripe about our boss all we want. Do you have like a list of grievances you want to share?
Yeah, it is time. It's time to get things off our chest. That's true. We'll save it for overtime. Maybe we'll save our list of grievances for the other side of the paywall.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good hook too. Yeah. You want to become an NCN member on Substack, Robert Wright's Nonzero Newsletter on Substack. You'll get access to the audio content. You'll hear us gossip about Bob a little bit. But you're right. I have a very expensive newborn baby, so I need to avoid getting fired if possible. Though I did get a natural disaster relief check from FEMA yesterday, totaling $750. So that could tide me over if needed.
Oh, man. I did not know that they just cut checks. That is funny.
They were surprisingly quick about it. They have this weird system where after you apply, and just to give context, I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, or that's where I live currently. And I had to flee Asheville, so now I'm in Alabama. And yeah, they're really quick. But when you apply for the relief funding, the first thing that happens is they tell you were rejected. And I was told that was going to happen, so don't be alarmed. And then the next day, the $750 arrives in your bank account. I don't understand the system, but that's how it works. But yeah, getting into this week's episode, the main thing we're going to be talking about today, at least in the public version of the episode, is the Middle East, of course. And you are a very good person to talk to about that subject because you've lived in the Middle East, you speak Arabic, you've covered this region as a journalist. And we're going to talk about a lot of topics, including the ultimatum that Benjamin Netanyahu gave to the Lebanese people, Kamala Harris's claim that Iran is America's greatest adversary, one important way in which Israel's assassination of Hamas's former leader has already backfired. But first, maybe just talking about the general situation. Obviously, the crisis in the Middle East is dynamic. Things are moving fast and could change significantly even by the time we post this episode tonight. So I guess we should say today is Friday, October 11th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're in kind of a strange moment. We're watching Israel's escalation in Lebanon. But at this point, Israel has not attacked, or not yet attacked, as everyone is expecting they will, Iran, in retaliation for Iran's ballistic missile attack on Israel last week, which was itself largely a response to Israel's various escalations in Lebanon. So maybe before we talk about items from the Earthling, Connor, I'd be curious to hear anything you want to say on the general situation, on Israel's military campaign in Lebanon, and its possibly impending military campaign in Iran, or anything else you think pertinent.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's so hard to say anything definitive about the Iran side of things. We've seen some indications that Israel's response might wind up being kind of less than we thought at first. There was questions of, are they going to strike oil facilities in Iran, which would have significant secondary effects for the global economy? Or are they going to attack nuclear facilities or things like that? It's become very much less clear what's going to happen. There's even some indications that they might, go maybe in the direction of assassinating a nuclear scientist in Iran rather than doing that. And it kind of shows in an interesting way the different pressures that the U.S. is under and that Israel are under that could constrain escalation at this point. You're seeing a lot of the Gulf states, for example, getting really anxious about the idea that Israel might strike Iranian oil facilities. Because if Israel does that, then you don't know if Iran is going to then retaliate against those Gulf states who make all their money from oil and take shots in that direction. So there's just so much going on that front. I mean, on a bit more concrete, maybe, or a bit easier to say specific things about is that Israel's invasion of Lebanon is definitely advancing. I think one of the most interesting lines I've seen about that in the last couple of days is this report from Reuters that Hezbollah has apparently managed to reconstitute some of its central planning. So that was a question at the start. Israel managed to assassinate or kill just about the entire Hezbollah leadership, or was able to create some graphics that were very compelling that seemed to be the entire Hezbollah leadership. And now what we're seeing is that there's been some level of reconstitution, some level of kind of centralizing activities, and that's going to make Israel's fight a lot harder. And it's also why we're going to start to see some more rocket attacks coming from Lebanon and into Israel, as we've started to see these last couple of days. So it's a lot going on at once, but we're starting to see things kind of settle in, I guess.
Yeah, no, on the Israel-Iran situation, which is the one that I find most concerning. I mean, it does certainly seem like an attack is coming still. Israel's security cabinet convened yesterday, I believe, to discuss possible military responses. We don't know the results exactly of that meeting, but most people seem to think that the security cabinet authorized Netanyahu to carry out an attack of some kind. Axios has reported that Netanyahu spoke with Joe Biden. They hadn't spoken since August, but apparently they got on the same page almost about the nature of these looming Israeli strikes on Iran. The White House had reportedly been concerned that Israel was going to overreach and kind of ratchet up the crisis further than necessary. I don't know if you saw this, there were even reports in Israeli media, and this to me seems completely absurd and inappropriate for like a superpower client relationship. But there were reports in Israeli media that the White House was offering a compensation package to Israel if it just kind of stuck to the U.S. approved targets in Iran. In any case, now
it's outrageous. It's all carrots. There's no such thing as sticks in the U.S. Israel relationship, and it's so funny because there's all this talk about how the Biden administration is breaking with Netanyahu, and there's all this controversy brewing, and the relationship is the worst that it's been in years. But the worst that it's been in years is still all carrots. It's still all incentives rather than saying we'll cut off arms if you bomb the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is all carrots. Everyone was saying, oh, Biden, you have leverage. Why aren't you using it? I guess this is the leverage that they thought of, not denying Israel anything, but kind of saying, you will get this extra thing if you do what we want. And according to this Axios reporting, the administration's concerns have been assuaged somewhat. They're apparently more happy with Israel's military plans than they were. Although supposedly Israel still hasn't briefed the U.S. military on exactly what they plan to do. So we'll just have to wait and see. Until the attack happens, I'll say what I said last week. I'm still holding out hope that Israel will do something to signal that although they are attacking, they're also kind of holding back, that they don't want to initiate another round of escalation. They're ready to step down or at least not climb further up the ladder of escalation. That's what happened after Iran's attack in April. When Israel responded by conducting a precision airstrike targeting an air defense system. It was just a show of force, basically. So I think they'll surely do something more dramatic than that, but there must be some intermediary options between super dramatic escalation and something that would be perceived as weakness or inaction. Anything else you want to say on the general situation before we turn to the Earthling?
No, let's dive into some items. We have a lot of good updates.
We do. We have a lot of. We're leading with a bunch of Middle East updates this week. The one that I think is getting the least attention relative to what it deserves is this update about Hamas and this assassination that happened recently. This change in leadership. Right. What did we read about here, Connor?
Yeah, so basically, this is an interesting item. This is based off of a Wall Street Journal article that came out this week that kind of, from our perspective, buried the lead a little bit. Basically, the article was highlighting that the new leader of Hamas, whose name is Yahya Sinwar, he has decided to restart suicide attacks within Israel. This is a tactic that Hamas had used, especially during the Second Intifada and a little bit during the first, but not as much. And this tactic is particularly, terrifying, is particularly likely to have a big effect on Israeli society. And in the view of the previous leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, it's a tactic that tends to backfire against the militant group that does it. Now, the problem is that Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated by Israel in Tehran while he was there for the inauguration of the new president at the very end of July earlier this year. And so by killing Haniyeh, Israel wound up kind of shifting the scales within Hamas back in the direction of the people who are in favor of these suicide attacks, which is a terrible thing because we've already started to see, I think, 3 total attacks in recent weeks. And the deep impact that these have, and the deep memories that Israelis have of the Second Intifada and of like fear of going on the bus, fear of being in public. It's really hard to describe just how terrible of a backfire this is for that decision, because it really is hard to think of something more terrifying than just a militant showing up in the street and opening fire. So that was kind of my basic reaction to that.
Yeah, it's political scientists say that decapitation strategies in general, taking out the leader of an organization in general, do not work. Whether we're talking about gangs or terror groups or other violent organizations. As I understand, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah who was recently killed, he became leader of Hezbollah after his predecessor was assassinated. And Nasrallah turned the group into a much more formidable and menacing adversary of Israel than it had been before. Possibly something similar is now happening with Hamas. It remains to be seen. Of course, both what's going on with Hezbollah and with Hamas now, as far as Israel's strategy, it's maybe more than just a decapitation strategy. They're taking out like the body as well. A lot of kind of middle manager types and foot soldiers. But still, the short-term consequences of that assassination so far appear to be bad for global and Israeli security.
Yeah.
I kind of want to move on to this Kamala Harris item.
This was outrageous.
Yeah, it was definitely, from my perspective, the most mystifying portion of Vice President Kamala Harris's recent interview with 60 Minutes when she was asked who was America's greatest adversary. She didn't answer China, which all the like U.S. strategy documents identify as our chief adversary. She didn't say Russia, though the U.S. has spent billions on Ukraine's defense against Russia, and U.S. officials act as if Putin's the next Hitler who's going to like march through Europe. She answered Iran, and she said Iran has American blood on its hands. And my first thought after hearing her answer was, hey, we're in business then. Like, we're the global superpower, and Iran, this like regional actor, is our biggest adversary. That doesn't sound too bad. It sounds like it could be worse. The foreign policy analyst Eldar Mammadov, he had a good piece about this in the American Conservative, which I'd encourage people to check out. I want to read a line from that piece. I jotted it down here. He wrote, quote, "The only conceivable threat from Iran to the U.S. comes from the Iranian proxy groups in Syria and Iraq. And it is in those countries where Iran presumably got its hands soaked in that American blood. The question that she, Kamala Harris, ought to be asking is, why are American troops still in those lands?" End quote. And that's exactly right, I think. I mean, this is something that really bothers me when someone says, someone like us says, hey, why are our troops just sitting ducks in the Middle East? What are they accomplishing there? Why are we putting them in harm's way? One answer you'll invariably hear is, we need to deter Iran. So we need to have these troops there. And when you ask why we need to deter Iran, the response often is, well, because Iran, they attack our soldiers, or they're, the militants that they back occasionally attack our soldiers. I mean, I'm no expert, but to me that sounds like a little bit of a circular logic. But Connor, what did you think about Harris's comment?
No, it's totally circular. It's totally. I agree. I mean, I think when you look at the video, you get the sense that she was surprised by the question or wasn't necessarily prepared for it. So maybe we'll give her a little bit of leeway there. But also at the same time, how do you not have a good answer to this question? I like what jumped out so much to me about this is that she really managed to get just about every single part of the foreign policy analytical community mad about this, because, if you're a hawk, you wish that she had talked about China. If you're a dove, you think that she is making war between the US and Iran more likely by highlighting the tensions. And if you're someone who's middle of the road, you're wondering why she's even talking about this. And so, yeah, I really got this sense that this was a bit of an own goal from Harris.
Yeah, you're right that it's kind of strange that she seemed not to have a kind of a ready answer for this. It kind of reminds me of, I think she was on The View and someone asked her, like, what would you do differently than Biden, or how would you be different from Biden? She, on multiple occasions, hasn't had an answer ready for that question, which is kind of strange because surely she can see it's coming by now. One thing that I just thought of while you were talking, as far as the Iran situation and how everyone kind of thought this sounded ridiculous, that she would say Iran is America's greatest adversary. I mean, I think this might be something that's changing, that could be kind of bad for Israel, where it no longer seems plausible to people that America is like deeply interested in, its national security is implicated inherently and directly in what's going on in the Middle East. Because a lot of people are starting to think that what we're doing in the Middle East is like on Israel's behalf, right? Like when the Bush administration, for example, launched the war in Iraq, critics of that invasion talked about, how the Bush administration was doing it for oil, or because of faulty intelligence related to WMDs, or because of an arrogant attempt to spread democracy, some sort of neoconservative ideology. But if the U.S. goes to war with Iran, if it gets sucked into a war in Iran because of what's going on between Israel and Iran right now, I think pretty much everyone is going to see it as the U.S. acting on Israel's behalf. And I think that could get really dicey for Israel if that becomes kind of the default way that people look at American military action in the Middle East. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for Israel, you're starting to see something that's very challenging, which is the U.S. does sincerely want to move its attention elsewhere, right? Like the only reason, or one of the main reasons that the U.S. has been so involved with Israel over these past however many years, especially the last like 50 or so, has been that we have other important interests in the Middle East that we're trying to protect. And that Israel fits well into those, and became a very close ally in protecting those. Not always successfully, not always well, but that was part of the deal. And you're right. I mean, now it is the case that the U.S. wants to spend a lot more time thinking about Europe, wants to spend a lot more time thinking about East Asia in particular, and thinking about China. And there's just not going to be as much room or as much appetite, I guess, in my view, for all kinds of interventions in the Middle East and all kinds of attention on the Middle East. It's, I mean, it's funny because I obviously, when I started studying Middle East related things, it was still kind of war on terror, and that was a bit of a different time. But I think that actually is starting to end now, sincerely. And as attention goes away, the kind of contradictions inherent in our presence there will be heightened.
Yeah, totally. And to your point about like China hawks being annoyed by Kamala Harris's answer, because they see China, not Iran, as the greatest adversary. Yeah. I mean, they kind of have a point. Like the U.S. is always talking about this pivot to Asia, which Obama really initiated, as I understand. And the pivot just won't happen. Like even now, there's like, I think the USS Abraham Lincoln is supposed to be like in Asia, but it's in the Mediterranean Sea because of all the situation happening with Israel, and because the U.S., of course, if there is like a general conflagration and Israel comes under attack, American forces are there to deter, that attack and to get involved if needed. So yeah, in some ways, I think that the China hawks have a point. Like this doesn't make sense from a national security perspective. Even from that perspective, which we don't really share, but I think is sensible. Maybe moving on to some other Middle East updates. We have a couple about video statements that Benjamin Netanyahu released recently. One was directed against French President Emmanuel Macron, and it was a very scathing, critical video statement. I can talk about that in a bit, but I think maybe the more interesting one is this ultimatum that Bibi gave to the Lebanese people. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, this one really I mean, it jumps out for a lot of reasons. One of which is that it's just really ominous, right? This is such a bizarre statement to see from a world leader. I really recommend, if you're listening to this and you haven't watched the video, we linked to it in the Earthling, so definitely go check it out. I recommend watching the thing in full. It's like 3 minutes. But the quote that we choose to highlight in the Earthling, I have it here. It's this is Netanyahu in an address to the Lebanese people. He says, "You will have the opportunity to save Lebanon before it falls into the abyss of a long war that will lead to destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza. Free your country from Hezbollah so that this war can end." And my initial reaction to that is, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you expect the Lebanese people to do in the face of Hezbollah? Even assuming that they hate Hezbollah, which I don't know if that's necessarily true, or even assuming that they really do want to eliminate them as a political force, you are either asking civilians to get involved and to do kind of who knows what to stop this, or you're asking the Lebanese military and other militia groups in the country to get involved, and that is a return of the civil war. And I really can't emphasize enough that like the Lebanese civil war is an extremely, extremely traumatic memory for everybody in Lebanon. It was disastrous. It lasted from 1975 to 1990, 15 years of death and destruction. And they do not want that back. They really don't. And so if you are Netanyahu and you're going in and doing this invasion and you're trying to get them on your side, then it might be a better approach to not tell them that they're going to return to the darkest chapter of their history.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and Hezbollah, it's the most formidable, largest, well-armed, professionalized militant group in the Middle East. Enough so that Israel is worried about it, enough that the Lebanese state has been able to fully assert control over Lebanese territory. So it is a little unclear what exactly the Lebanese people can be expected to do about it. And yeah, it's so ominous. I mean, it basically it is a threat. Like, we're going to turn you into Gaza. Certainly ominous and bleak, especially if you're a Lebanese person or living in Lebanon. I mean, do you have any ideas about who is the actual audience for Bibi's video statement?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you'll notice anyone that goes and watches the video will notice that it's in English with English subtitles. And if you know a lot of Lebanese people, they do speak pretty good English, but that suggests to me that it's, they speak Arabic and French mainly in Lebanon. And so the audience, if it was Lebanese, would have not really received the message perfectly, right? So I think it's really trying to communicate to the broader world. I think it's trying to communicate to the international community a little bit more and say basically oh, we are trying to kind of seem more, this is a way of us being humane, essentially. This is a way of us. I would say it's analogous. A big part of, I guess, pulling back a little bit. So Israel often gets mad when people accuse Israeli soldiers of war crimes, if those war crimes involve bombing a building or something. And part of that is that Israel believes, as part of its kind of approach to international law and as part of its approach to war in general, that if you give a warning before attacking a civilian area, and if you either do, they call it knocking on the roof, have a dud missile that hits first and gives you 5 or 10 minutes to get out, or dropping leaflets, or asking people to leave, that is sufficient for removing the responsibility after. And I think that this is the kind of grander version of knocking on the roof, right? This is Netanyahu saying, we'd love for you guys to do this. We would totally prefer that you guys handle this yourselves. But the thing that has to happen is that Hezbollah has to go. So either you will do it or we will do it. And that is an ultimatum that I don't really think was meant to be, answered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense to me. A lot of scholars of international relations, like political scientists who study international relations and who focus on international law, a lot of them, they kind of concede that international law doesn't constrain state behavior often in the way that maybe more liberal-minded people wish it did. But it does have empirical significance in the sense that it kind of changes the way that states operate. it maybe makes it more likely
Totally.
that a state is going to drop leaflets or release some sort of video statement to make it seem like they're doing something to kind of minimize civilian casualties, and make it so the response is proportionate, in that sense, or the military campaign is proportionate and doesn't exceed what's necessary for the mission in terms of loss of civilian life. And that was my first thought too. Like I was a little, it was a little unclear to me what exactly the video was meant to accomplish. Because when I did think about it as, okay, well, maybe the Lebanese people aren't actually the intended audience. Maybe the international community is in general. I thought, well, this doesn't look so good to the international community. To a lot of people, it kind of looks like Bibi is threatening to turn the neighborhood, Israel's neighborhood, I mean, in the Middle East, into Gaza, right? Like Gaza as it exists now, like most buildings destroyed, people displaced. And I think from the average person's perspective, maybe not the average person in the West, but certainly the average person outside of the West, Israel increasingly looks like a rogue pariah state. And I don't know how much these video statements help Israel with its image in that respect. But I kind of want to move on to this other video statement. I thought it was also interesting. So to kind of set the scene, over the weekend, French President Emmanuel Macron urged world leaders to halt weapons deliveries to Israel for use in Gaza. France doesn't itself. It hasn't shipped major arms. I think they have like gun companies and stuff that maybe sell to Israelis, but they haven't shipped major arms to Israel since like 1998. But Macron said that other countries should stop doing so. I think he's the most prominent Western leader to say this, probably by far. He said that the arms shipments were inconsistent with calls for a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon, and basically counterproductive to finding a political solution to the broader crisis. And apparently, Macron made his comments in a radio interview that took place early last week, like on Monday or something. But the interview didn't air until the weekend, which was a little awkward since the anniversary of October 7th was Monday, right? So that kind of made it seem controversial, even within French politics, as I understand. He was getting criticized by a lot of French politicians. And then he really received pushback from Israel. And perhaps for that reason, because I think Macron has said something similar before, but this time, like the Israeli media paid more attention and the Israeli political class paid a lot of attention. And Netanyahu released a video statement basically castigating Macron. I don't have the quotes in front of me, but he was basically making the case that, Israel is under siege, and all civilized countries should stand with Israel against the forces of barbarism. And he linked it to Iran, like the Iranian-backed forces of darkness or whatever he said. One of the interesting things about Netanyahu's video statement is it really confirms that the Israeli government sees itself already as being engaged in a wide regional war. Because he mentioned that Israel is defending itself on 7 fronts. I don't even think I'm going to be able to remember all of the fronts. It's like Gaza, the West Bank, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Yemen, and Lebanon, right? Those are the 7. Yep. And he mentioned all of the adversaries in those countries like the Houthis and Hamas and et cetera, that Israel is fighting. So that was one thing that was interesting about it. It was also just interesting how scathing it was toward Macron. Like he called him out by name. And maybe the last thing I'll say, there was kind of a back and forth between like the Israeli and French governments over this. And one thing that I found interesting about the French government statements was that they were saying, hey, we're not like anti-Israel. These weren't anti-Israel comments that Macron made. Like, this is actually pro-Israel. Like, we're a friend of Israel. We think this situation is bad for Israel. And kind of similar to how you and Bob and I were talking last week on Earthling Unplugged, these weapons are helping Israel accomplish a lot of like tactical gains, make tactical successes, but they're not really leading to like a strategic political solution to all of this. And in Macron's view, and in I think our view, that political solution necessarily involves a ceasefire and some in Gaza and in Lebanon, but especially in Gaza, some consideration of like what happens next. What is the day after going to look like? Because until that gets worked out and we at least have some indication of what Israel is imagining, this just seems like there's no end in sight to this
Yeah.
unfolding disaster.
Yeah, and this is a Netanyahu's comment there is a useful reminder that even though there's this international kind of escalation happening across the region, that the fighting in Gaza remains fairly intense. That has kind of fallen out of the headlines, but just these last couple of days, Israel has ordered all 400,000 civilians in northern Gaza to evacuate that area so that they can continue an offensive there. There's been at least 100 deaths from Israeli attacks in the past couple of days. And I think that there were also some cases in which Hamas was able to injure at least some Israeli soldiers. So there's pretty active fighting happening within Gaza. And it really makes you wonder, like, Israel is not a big country. I just have this question back of my mind of, like, how are they going to be able to, sustain really active operations in Lebanon, sustain really active operations in Gaza, and to an extent in the West Bank, and then deal with all of these kind of more missile back and forth fights that they're having with other countries. I mean, it just seems like, for a country that has, I want to say I think they have like 150,000 to 200,000 active duty soldiers, they're going to be stretched really thin. They're going to be stretched really, really thin, and I'm just not sure how they're going to manage to maintain this campaign for a particularly long period of time. So I guess that's like one factor that points in the direction of this not lasting too long, or one kind of constraint that Israel can't really get around, even if it has better weapons, is that they just don't have necessarily as many people as some of these other countries. They don't have, you can't just leave people fighting for months and months at a time. That has a big impact on your soldiers. It makes them less effective.
Yeah, I think Israel's total population is like less than 10 million, isn't it? It's like 9 million. I think Iran's is 10 times that. Clearly, Israel has some major advantages in terms of its conventional and its nuclear military capabilities, because it actually has nuclear weapons, unlike Iran. But at some point, I agree that the population size difference makes you wonder how they can sustain these military operations indefinitely. Maybe we'll do now something that I actually said we weren't going to do. I thought we could do a fade out, but why don't we go ahead and mention that we're going to be entering into overtime. So that is one of the exclusive audio features that we offer at the Nonzero Newsletter. To gain access to that exclusive audio, including the rest of this conversation, you should go to Robert Wright's Nonzero Newsletter on Substack and become an NZN member today. We have all sorts of audio content there. The overtime episodes of the Earthling Unplugged, and also Robert Wright's conversations that he has twice a week with interesting guests. And then there's some audio essays and stuff too that you'll have access to if you do that. And of course, you're going to hear us gossip about Bob eventually, gripe about our boss, which I can't think of anything else worth spending money on more than that. So to those who are listening still, thank you for listening. And now let's go into overtime. This was a free preview of Earthling Unplugged. To unlock the rest of this conversation and other exclusive audio content, become an NZN member at nonzero.substack.com.